bell for the end of the school day may have rung, but the learning doesn't end there. This is your Geography Revision session. We're covering Year 8, Module 1, Our Shrinking World. I'm Mr. S, and I'll be your revision tutor. Our Shrinking World is all about globalisation. As a planet, we are now more connected and dependent on each other than ever before. This brings huge advantages, but also some serious problems. As always, we have 5 elements to look at, so let's start with globalisation. Globalisation is the process of countries becoming more connected, and this is because of technology and transport developments. So what we're talking about here is technologies that have allowed us to do things across the world that we were never able to do before. For example, the mobile phone has allowed us to communicate with everyone around the world incredibly easily. If you think back 50, 60 years ago, that was not always the case. You were attached to a landline phone in the house. But if we go even further back, before the telephone, you had the telegraph, which was the little thing that you had to tap and it made beeps in Morse code. Imagine trying to conduct business across the world by only using Morse code. It would have been incredibly difficult. But it's not just that technology. The internet has been a massive help for this, but one other thing, and perhaps even more of an advantage, was the development of transport. If we go back even just 50 or 60 years ago, to get to Australia would have taken 3 weeks by steamboat. Today, that has now been cut down to 24 hours, and in the last year, they've even increased the flight time so that you don't even have to stop between the UK and Australia. You can go direct from London to Perth. Never been done before. And this is all because our technology is continuing to advance. And this has a knock-on effect for things like trade, so countries and companies sharing goods and money, but also in terms of how this technology is shared. And this is leading to something called interdependence. This is where countries have become more reliant or more dependent on other countries for things that we need. For example, in the UK, we can't grow all the food that we need. Some of the food that we like also doesn't grow in the UK because we don't have the right climate. Or if we wanted something all the year round, like strawberries, which do grow in the UK but only in the summer, well, we're not going to be able to eat those in the winter unless we get them from somewhere like Spain. And therefore, places like the UK and other countries around the world have become really dependent on other countries in order to get the food they need, in order to make sure that money comes in, and to make sure that there's enough jobs for everybody to have. And this is one big interlinked web that's all part of this globalisation. And this is leading to something called the shrinking world. Our module is called Our Shrinking World. However, we're not actually talking about the world shrinking. That's not what's happening. You can see here, the diagram on the left-hand side represents what we're talking about. Now, imagine the world. Obviously, it hasn't actually changed in shape or size, but with the technology of the time in the 1700s, which were ships that required wind to sail, it would have taken 2 years to sail around the globe. So that's saying it would have taken a long time. That's what the size of this planet is representing. In the 1930s, we had propeller aircraft, very small, light aircraft. And that could have went around the world in 8 days, continuously. Obviously, there would have been stops. And then you come to today, and we've got jet aircraft. Concorde, which is no longer flying, but is still one of the fastest passenger jets that we have, would have taken 31 hours to go around the world, so just over a day. So you can see the technology and the transport have increased to a point where it doesn't take as long to travel anywhere in the world, so it feels like our world has become smaller. This has been even further enhanced by the internet. We can look at and investigate other countries around the world. Say if we want to go on holiday, we can even use Google Street View to see what the place is like, what the hotel is like, have a look at all the different landmarks we want to go and visit, and it almost feels like you're there. Imagine trying to book a holiday to somewhere like Japan 30 or 40 years ago, where that wasn't possible. You would have had no information other than perhaps a little bit of a magazine from somebody who had been. technology allowed us to feel like our planet is not as big as it once was. And that's what that shrinking world is. Now, there are other things that have come with our globalisation, such as foreign investment. And this is where companies or countries from other parts of the world put money into developing services or infrastructure in that country. For example, Germany bought the metro that runs through Newcastle, Gateshead and into Sunderland. And they put money into that to improve it. And they hope to get money back. That was why they did it. But foreign investment is putting money into other countries to try and make some money themselves by increasing or developing the services and the infrastructure there. And we also have something called MNCs. And these are multinational corporations or multinational companies. They're huge companies and they operate in not just one country, but right the way around the world. There are some huge ones that you use on a daily basis. If you've ever went for a McDonald's, that is an MNC. The headquarters for McDonald's is in the USA. However, they've got stores in nearly every country on the planet. It's one of the biggest MNCs around the world. Technology companies like Apple and Samsung have their headquarters in one country but have loads of places where they manufacture the phones in some countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, and then sell them in stores right the way around the world. And this brings us on to how we classify some of our countries. So we have HICs, NICs and LICs. The UK is a HIC and it stands for High Income Country. Now that means that it's a richer country. It's got more income, more money in the bank. An LIC is a poorer country, so low income country. And places like Bangladesh would be an example of that, and quite a few countries in Africa. And then we have NICs. And these are interesting because they were once LICs, but they're starting to earn a bit more money from manufacturing and producing products that other countries have become dependent on those countries to do. And it's been made possible because of the globalisation and the increase in technology and transport to get those goods all the way around the world. So places like China and India are examples of newly industrialised countries where they were once poorer countries but are now starting to improve in their development through globalisation. Next up we have global division. Now we've been talking about HIC, LIC and NIC. There was a map drawn up that had a line that split the world up into two halves. And this is called the Brandt line. And the Brandt line is an imaginary line that divides the richer half of the world from the poorer half of the world. So you can see here the darker orange is the poorer south and the lighter is the richer north. Now that's not to say that every country that's below this line is going to be poor and every country above it is going to be richer. It's just a general pattern. And it was also made quite a while ago, so things have changed. But you'll also notice that things don't fit the pattern. Australia and New Zealand are technically HICs, but they're in the south. So this line has had to be drawn around those to include them in the right side of it. In the south, we're going to find our LICs, and then in the north, we're going to find our HICs. But as I said, there are these group NICs, the newly industrialised countries, which are in between. So the likes of China and India don't fit this pattern because it's not a clear cut between rich and poor. We've talked about LICs. Now in LICs they tend to have something called absolute poverty, and that's where they have a severe lack of human basic needs. So for example, they don't have enough money for food, for their health, for shelter, education. And these are some of the poorest locations or the poorest areas on our planet. To be in absolute poverty, you generally have to be earning less than $1 a day. And that's really, really small. So imagine probably about 90 pence a day. And there's not much you can buy for 90 pence. Then there's relative poverty. Now relative poverty happens all the way around the world. There is relative poverty in the UK. Basically means that you lack the minimum amount of income needed to maintain an average standard of living where you live. In another word, you could describe it as that you have less money on average than the people around you. And so that could happen in Africa where there's more LICs, but it could also happen in the UK, where it's a HIC. You could have, on average, less money than what's required to live in that area. Next, we have global inequalities, and we're going to look at two factors here. The first one is child labour, and the second one is how those MNCs, those multinational corporations, are working in low-income countries. Let's focus first on child labour. So child labour is children that have been forced to work or have to work for whatever reason. And there's a few reasons why this occurs. Now you can see some pictures down the side here of some examples of what child labour might look like. So predominantly it's low skilled work where they just need somebody for manpower. You can see a child here carrying some heavy rocks, for example, or breaking up bricks for aggregate to go into like the foundations of a building. Or you've got people that are picking through rubbish on a landfill site to find valuable materials like metals and plastics that they can earn money from. And the reason why child labour ends up happening can come down to a few reasons, and it can be linked to MNCs. For example, MNCs operate in LICs, in low-income countries, because there's often not a lot of laws saying who can work. So in this case, are children allowed to work? In the UK, you're not. Can children work? How much money do you have to pay them? In a lot of countries, in LICs, there isn't a law that says you have to give somebody a certain amount of money, or how long they have to work for, or whether or not they get paid for overtime. And so to make those products as cheap as possible to sell, and so that the MNCs get as much money as possible, they operate in these poorer countries by making sure that the products are produced for a very low price. And so child labour is often one of those reasons why these products are so cheap. LICs also have very few laws, as we've discussed, so MNCs can hire anybody, even children, and pay them very, very little. And families will also need money to survive. If you've got a large family, you might need your children to work in order to be able to feed everybody. Or your parents might be sick, and you might have to go out to work because there's no social security. For example, in the UK we have sick pay. If somebody can't work, the state gives them money. Or maybe they don't have a family. There is a high death rate in some countries, meaning that often adults die, and therefore the children will have to work in order to feed themselves. And what is the effects of child labour? Well, long hours and very little pay mean that children end up being overworked. Poor working conditions mean that injuries become very, very likely, and this could be things like cuts and burns and even blindness in some cases, or, very seriously, death. And children can't get an education, and therefore they're stuck in this cycle, not be able to better themselves to get a better job, and be stuck in the same cycle that they've been in all their lives. Now, there have been a few strategies put in place, and child labour has started to reduce around the world. The Atlanta Agreement was a response to the Salcott footballs, which you studied in lessons, where they had a lot of children making footballs for Europe, and which were in very, very poor working conditions. The Atlanta Agreement aimed to improve the working conditions for families and prevent children from working in that industry. But there's also been fair trade, and that pays local workers a living wage. That means it pays them enough money so they can actually live, not just a small amount as a token gesture, but actually enough money to pay for the rent, to pay for the food that they need, pay for the education for their children, a minimum wage, and funds improvements in the local area. So if that local area doesn't have a school, the Fair Trade Foundation would put some money towards building a school in the local community so children could get an education. And this leads us on to our MNCs. Now, MNCs do have some advantages. They go into LICs and they do provide jobs where there may not have been jobs in the first place. So even though it might only be £2 a day, it's £2 more than they were earning before. It also helps the government exploit what natural resources they have. It may be an MNC that does mining, and they come in with all of their technology and their knowledge to help the government get coal or metals out of the ground that they wouldn't be able to do themselves. MNCs also have to pay taxes. They earn money and pay taxes to the local government, but it's probably not the same amount of tax that they would pay back in their home country. And it also encourages more MNCs to set up. If they can see, for example, that Apple has set up a manufacturing in Bangladesh and it's working really well, well, that might mean, well, Samsung needs a new place. Well, Apple are doing it there, so I'll do it there as well. And it brings more and more businesses, which means more jobs and more taxes. And it also, some companies even educate their workers. They improve them, they train them, which means that in the future, they might be able to go on and do something better and earn a better wage. However, there are substantial negatives to MNCs. So LICs don't have strong labour laws, and this means that their workers are more likely to be exploited, working long hours for low pay. MNCs also have poor working conditions in some countries, meaning that it's more likely that people get injured. And the use of child labour is still an issue, even though it has reduced. But one of the biggest issues is that although they are helping these LICs, most of the money doesn't stay in the LIC, it goes home to the HIC where they've got their headquarters. For example, Apple, most of their money from the manufacturing in Southeast Asia doesn't stay in Southeast Asia to help with the economy and help with improvements of the area. It goes back to California in the USA, which is already a very rich country. Next, we have global flows. And what we're looking at here are, where do our goods come from when they're coming into the UK? We know that we depend on other countries, but what are they and what are the reasons for buying from them? The diagram that you've got here represents the major countries that we've bought goods from. So this is called imports, things that we bring into the country. And the size of the circle represents how much we've actually brought in terms of money. You can see there are two very large circles here. One is Germany, and the second one is China. Now we can kind of understand Germany because it's one of our closest neighbours, and it brings in the most for us with £56 billion worth of imports from Germany. But China comes in a very close second with 31.6 billion, and that's on the other side of the world. It's far, far away. Now, there's a distinction to be made between these, isn't there? So you can see that the Netherlands, Belgium and Germany all bring in quite a large amount, and they're HICs. So Europe and North America, they're closer to us, which means it's easier to transport things that might go off very quickly, like food. It's got like a shelf life. Or livestock, live animals, which would not be possible from further away. And it's also more likely that these places will have higher standards for food and hygiene, meaning that we're more likely to trade with these people, or these countries, sorry. But there's also one other thing we need to consider. Europe, at the minute we're still in the European Union, and we have strong trading relationships because we're inside a group of countries that trade with each other, which means that we're more likely to buy from these countries because it's cheaper to do so. We don't have any tariffs or any taxes to pay on things that come in. As for China, well, that's an LIC/NIC. It's a newly industrialized country. And the reason why we bring in so much from China is that the workers are cheap there, so they don't cost as much, and there's much more of those workers, which means that they're making more products. And if they've got a lot of products, those products are going to be cheaper because there's a lot more of them. So MNCs make huge profits from these countries by selling their products at a higher price to make a larger profit, but that's still cheaper than making them in HICs, which means we end up buying more from further away in Asia because it's cheaper. But it's probably not going to be the food stuffs and the livestock because it'll take longer to travel over to the UK. It's more likely to be things like stationery, it could be furniture, electronics, things like that. But we do get things from other countries as well. So there are other nations over here. You can see that they're still part of Europe. You've got Italy, France, Switzerland, Spain. The Republic of Ireland are our closest neighbour, but actually doesn't bring us in much in comparison. And finally, we have sustainability. This is a big issue for globalisation. As we're expanding out into the world, we are causing damage to our planet as well. And we're looking more closely at the minute, in the last few years, about how do we reduce the impact that globalisation is having on our planet. As a recap, sustainability is providing the best for people and the environment now and indefinitely in the future. So by that we mean we can live today comfortably, but we're not going to ruin our planet for people in the future. We need to be able to survive in the future as well. And one of the biggest issues for globalisation is the global plastics crisis. Plastic is a really cheap and easy to produce product. It's light, which means it's fantastic for packaging. And when all these products are flying across the skies or in our oceans to travel between countries, they're usually packaged up with plastic. And unfortunately, this is making its way into our oceans. So plastics are light, hygienic, they make perfect material for protecting food and products, including drinks. And there are 80 billion plastic bottles sold in 2016 alone. And fewer than half of those bottles are collected for recycling. So it's all got to end up somewhere. And you can see some of the effects on the pictures here. All this pollution floating around in the ocean. Plastics take hundreds, if not thousands of years to fully degrade back to their constituent parts. And in most cases, they break down into these really small microplastics, which obviously are a lot smaller than these and aren't going to cause immediate death, but build up in animal stomachs and lungs and will cause long-term health problems. And there's even been evidence that it's made its way into our food chain, into the human food chain, which means that you could be eating microplastics in the food that you consume on a daily basis. So the effects of animals eating or suffocating or getting trapped in plastics, while sea life such as birds, whales and fish and turtles are mistaking these plastic bags for jellyfish. And therefore they are filling up on plastics, which means that they don't feel as hungry and are less likely to eat or incapable of eating as well. So they mistake the plastic for prey. Most die of starvation as their stomachs are full with plastic. Invisible plastics have also been found in tap water, in beer and in salt. And plastic waste damage also looks bad for tourism. Can you imagine being on holiday and seeing this floating in the water? You would not want to go into the sea, and you'd probably end up choosing to go somewhere else. So tourist destinations are losing money through the decreased tourism that has been caused by plastic waste. If we look at what we've done as a nation, just the UK, well, a few years ago we introduced the plastic bag fee, whereby we had to pay 5 pence for a plastic bag. And while that sounds very small, it's actually had a massive impact on what people do at supermarkets. And it means that people have actually started to modify their habits. So nationally, the government introduced the plastic bag tax. But that also then led to more people using bags for life. Buying one bag that's slightly more expensive, say £2, but then taking it on every shop that you do. That's reducing the amount of plastic that you're purchasing. Also locally, people are now choosing to buy products that don't have a lot of plastic packaging or reduced packaging on them. Amazon has even started its own, what it's called frustration-free packaging, but they're reducing the amount of plastic that their products come in and place them into cardboard boxes instead. So this is happening on a local scale, people choosing to buy products over others because of the packaging that they've got, but also companies are responding to this as well and changing the types of packaging they're using, going for biodegradable, going for completely recyclable packaging on top of it. Well, that's it for today, but don't forget to complete the home study questions to test yourself. Goodbye.